Good morning, my fine people. I hope everybody's enjoying their lockdown. Right, okay. So, a bit like last week, I'm going to split across the kind of 2 days chapters, the three chapters that we're going to be looking at even. So, we've got Grapes of Wrath, chapter 23 to 25. You should have done the pre-reading that I sent out last week around this. It's just to make sure we're kind of covering all bets, make sure you have got all the material covered. So no matter what happens with the exams, we're kind of ready for it. Right, only kind of two main things we're going to do today. I'll point out a couple of other bits kind of more briefly alongside. The first thing that we're going to do, we're going to use chapter 23. And we're going to link that again, a bit like last week, into kind of ideas of Marxist interpretation, and show how Steinbeck is kind of obviously not necessarily a communist, but he's definitely been affected by kind of Marxist ideas, Marxist mentality. Chapter 24, I'll point out kind of a brief bit, but whilst chapter 24 kind of pushes the narrative forward in kind of in terms of storytelling, it doesn't really do a great deal new in terms of those links to the context that you're going to have to be making. So with chapter 24, we're not going to introduce any real new ideas, but in those really good points, in the best points in the exam, you would be connecting together different bits of evidence. And by connecting together those different bits of evidence, you're going to be making more kind of sophisticated points, okay? So within that, we're going to simply find bits that kind of continue themes and ideas that Steinbeck has already introduced, and kind of link those in as well, okay? So first thing that you guys need to do, you need to find out what exactly Marx meant by the idea of kind of false class consciousness, and you need to do a little bit more research around it. What kind of institutions within society kind of maintain it? How is false class consciousness kind of promoted and kind of maintained through it? Okay, so spend kind of 5-10 minutes, look it up, find it out. Those of you who do sociology, hopefully you already know this, and you should be able to kind of come up with a nice definition without even needing to look anything up. So it'd be a nice revision for you there. If not, you need to revise over it. So have a look now, find what you can. Okay, now what essentially false class consciousness is that in society, those at the bottom believe that they're being treated, at least to an extent, fairly. So they're not, they're being exploited. This is false class consciousness, but there is this kind of collective belief that they are, you know, their position is, even if it's not fair, that it's justified, essentially. And when Marx talks about this, when Marx talks about this, he talks about different institutions that allow this to kind of be reinforced. So he talks about kind of religion, he talks about education, he talks about the kind of consumeristic culture that kind of goes with capitalism. He talks about the media we get kind of as part of it. So if people have religion and this belief of a kind of better world that comes after, then they'll ignore the fact that they are being exploited to quite such an extent in the world around them. Sorry, I'm just laughing because the kitten keeps going around and knocking stuff off various different places. We also have, you know, the media. So if you're able to kind of unwind, you're able to watch Netflix for hours on end, it kind of distracts you from the way you're being exploited. Education supposedly creates this image of a kind of meritocracy in which those who are best suited rise to the top and anyone can get to the top. And obviously, if you're able to kind of buy things, that kind of consumeristic culture again, you feel like you're kind of part of the system. You're kind of, you're not completely cut off. So, in terms of this, that kind of idea is kind of maintained. Now, Steinbeck shows this through. Okay, so I've done a kind of point from chapter 23 here, and then you're going to use the sheet that kind of comes with this email to kind of build a bit more out of this. Okay, so we now have a kitten who has just appeared. Okay. Steinbeck, so this would be my introduction to the point, and my kind of line of argument. Arguably, Steinbeck follows Marx in suggesting that American society has created a system in which those at the bottom are provided with just enough distraction to hide their abuse or reason to suffer their abuse. So they're either given something that hides it away from them, or they're given a justification for it. Okay. And I would have this bit as my piece of evidence: the migrant people scuttling for work, scrabbling to live. And I would, if I was building this a bit more, it initially kind of shows their struggle, they're scuttling, they're scrabbling, and yet they're looking for pleasure, they're manufacturing pleasure, they're hungry for amusement that's going to distract them from this exploitation. So rather than rising up, rather than fighting back, rather than this kind of revolution, they instead, simply seek distraction. So it kind of continues here. I know it's cut off slides on the sheet though, so on the left-hand side of the sheet that I've sent with this whole point is there. So he suggests this false class consciousness has been created in which various outlets hide or justify their exploitation. He juxtaposes the images of the dehumanization, so the scuttling, the scrabbling, with images of a desperate seeking for pleasure or justification. So he's creating this image of kind of false class consciousness where they're being distracted, and this is, at least for the time being, stopping them fully recognize just how exploited they are and how they're kind of not quite rebelling at this point. So what I need you to do, I need you to look on the first page of the sheet that I've kind of sent with you. And there should be 5 different little bits from chapter 23. Now, what I want you to think within those bits of evidence, how is Steinbeck suggesting that false class consciousness is being created? What kind of institution? How is it doing it? So, in fact, just to make it clear, I'll do the first one kind of together with you. I've put down here the storytellers gathering attention into their tales, spoke in great rhythm, spoke in great words because the tales were great and the listeners became great through them. Now, this one's kind of important, that idea of the storytelling and the whole myth of America that anyone can become great. So those stories, those kind of ideas of the American dream serve to kind of further false class consciousness. They continue to promote this idea that from hardship, from the bottom, anyone can rise up. So the tales were great and the listeners became great through them. So if you're talking about that, you talk about the importance of the storytelling and promoting this kind of false class consciousness and that idea of kind of the American dream, placating people essentially. So do the same thing with the other ones. Think about what's happening in each one. Annotate for them. They are too long to quote end to end if you were using them in an essay, but you'd be able to kind of contextualize them and you'd choose a few shorter bits around them that you could kind of use as part of it. Okay, so I would say you're probably going to spend probably about 10-15 minutes maybe kind of working around those, and then I'll go through them. Right, okay, so in terms of this, the second one down then, is essentially that the film reference is important. Obviously, the film is part of the media industry. So Steinbeck suggesting this kind of myth of America is one thing. Then you get the film industry, so part of the media. And think about the film he's kind of depicting here within the chapter. And perhaps a man balanced 20 cents between food and pleasure, and he went to a movie. And then he tells how it was. There was this rich fella, and he makes like he's poor, and there's this rich girl, and she pretends like she's poor too, and they meet in a hamburger stand. Now, these kind of stories, these myths that are being promoted, is kind of again something Steinbeck's attacking essentially. And again, you've got to treat it within the wider context of the chapter. But the kind of plot line of this film is that these two rich people want to be poor because at least then they know if they fall in love, it's not because of their wealth. So there's this idea of something kind of romanticized about being poor, something better about being poor that's being promoted through this kind of film here. So again, Steinbeck is showing another level of this kind of false class consciousness, the way in which these different bits of society kind of justify these positions of poverty. They mitigate it and they make people feel comfortable in this position. The next one, remember, we're past the point of prohibition. So we get, and always if you had a little money, a man could get drunk. The hard edge is gone and the warmth. And then there was no loneness, for a man could people his brain with friends, and he could find his enemies and destroy them. Sitting in a ditch, the earth grew soft under him. So essentially, Steinbeck is suggesting that simply giving people kind of alcohol, those kind of recreational actions, again, is another way of promoting this false class consciousness, that they allow people distraction, they soften their lives just enough. So the earth grew soft under him. There was no loneliness. He can people his brain with friends. It kind of cuts off the levels of isolation that are kind of depicted here. The next one, play the story songs as I walked through the streets of Laredo. Now, if you look this up, it's a kind of a cowboy western song essentially. And again, it comes back not just through the storytelling, but these kind of the songs, this older idea of America being brought in, America, this kind of place of opportunity where people can succeed in anything they want. So he's again suggesting another method by which false class consciousness is kind of promoted here. And I want my last one. Yeah, so this last one is kind of done in a slightly more vicious way. And as I said before, and Marx kind of comments on this. Marx describes religion as being the opium of the masses. So he kind of implies it's almost like a drug to them. And the last image here around the false class consciousness is of religion. Beside an irrigation ditch, a preacher laboured, and the people cried, and the preacher paced like a tiger, whipping the people with his voice, and they grovelled and whined, and calculated them, gauged them, played on them, and when they were all squirming on the ground, he stooped, and out of his great strength he picked one up in his arms, and shouted, "Take 'em, Christ," and threw each one in the water. So within this, the preacher figure is presented as quite kind of manipulative. He's presented as kind of vicious figure. He's whipping them. He's tiger-like. And the people are reduced to kind of groveling messes. And you then get the image of a kind of baptismal image at the end. Now, through this, Steinbeck is kind of suggesting that religion is another way that kind of people's position is justified to them. It kind of promotes that to them. but he does it in a kind of unattractive way. This is not the kind of religion, remember, that Steinbeck is a proponent of. He sees this as a kind of a religion that doesn't provide any kind of real support for people. It simply suggests that they are at fault for the position they're in. This is the kind of hellfire preaching, and that they almost deserve this position now, but they have the chance of redemption in the next life. So they've simply got to live with it now, but they've got that kind of future potential that goes with it. So chapter 23, your main point that you might make about is the way that he kind of suggests different methods of kind of creation of false class consciousness through religion, through the kind of stories and songs that promote this kind of old American dream kind of ideal, through the media industry, and through kind of the promotion of alcohol and things like that, that gives people the distraction that they kind of need. Righty then. Yeah, as a quick kind of challenge element, what I want you to do, just off the top of your head, list the 10 historical events that you believe have kind of created the most change in the world. They don't have to be recent, they can be right back into the past, but I want to just kind of draw out a common trend from them, hopefully, that I can then link into the kind of discussion around chapter 24. So pause me there, write up a list. Okay, if I had to guess, I would say that a lot of you will have come up with World War One, World War Two. You'll have come up with maybe the Gulf War. You'll have come up with things like the dissolution of monasteries, Wars of the Roses. You might have come up with stuff like, you know, the invention of the internet. You might have come up with things like the civil rights movement. You might have come up with the suffragettes movement. Now, one of the kind of common trends that goes with all of these is that with big historic events that kind of change the nature of the world, a lot of the time violence is a part of them. Even if you take something like the suffragettes, you have the more violent kind of terrorist-based activities. Yes, you have the kind of non-violence of Martin Luther King with the kind of civil rights movement. You also have kind of Malcolm X, and you have the kind of more militaristic aspects within the kind of the Black Panthers, and things like this. So you want to kind of recognize how within chapter 24, as one of the key things before we move on to the sheet, that Steinbeck is kind of exploring in relation to kind of the migrant movement, is that inevitably the change will come with violence, is kind of the implication, that it won't happen in a kind of non-violent way. So this is the only new bit I'll kind of introduce in relation to chapter 24, then it'll be kind of going over and kind of building up around other kind of older bits. So it's a kind of central within the narrative. You get the dance, and within the dance there's the kind of potential threat of the sheriffs, and beyond that it's simply a kind of continuation of the themes that have been introduced earlier. Now, there are a number of kind of discourses that kind of go around this. So having this whole narrative allows him to introduce different kind of conversations within it. And these different conversations in different ways explore the kind of power and protection that coming together offers. Hence why they're able to kind of protect themselves. And in many ways, this initial non-violence of the migrants, the fact that they hold back from the violence they could kind of carry out together, shows that they are morally superior to people like the kind of police force, to the more general kind of Californian population. So it shows Steinbeck trying to kind of elevate them. It doesn't mean that there won't be violence in the future, though. So Steinbeck does suggest that whilst there is no violence at kind of this specific point, that inevitably it will reach a point where it will kind of break and they can go kind of no further. So I'll just point out a couple of points here from chapter 24. So this is kind of going towards the end of chapter 24. Listen, you, he said, we're letting you off this time, but you take back the word. If and ever this happens again, we'll just naturally kick the hell out of whoever comes. We'll bust every bone in their body. So this is the kind of threat that those trying to infiltrate the dance are kind of left with. There's that kind of implication that, yes, at this point they're restraining from violence, but if it continues, they will be kind of left with no choice but to resort to this. And Parr kind of says towards the end here, you just have to find it more directly in the chapter, it's slightly off here. There's a change coming, I don't know what. Maybe I won't live to see her, but she's a coming. There's a restless feeling. Fella can't figure nothing, he's so nervous. And within this, you get this kind of idea of the whole of society around them becoming kind of edgy. We're on the edge of something. Steinbeck is placing the migrant community on the edge of a kind of precipice, at a point of kind of turning, a pivot point essentially, because of the pressures that are being kind of placed upon them. Okay, so there is a change coming, and it may well come with violence. Right. Now, the other thing that we're going to do, and I say it's just a kind of, more than anything, it's a continuation of other ideas that we've already come across in the narrative. You need to use the second page of the sheet that I've given you. And on that second page of the sheet, I have just kind of picked out, I think is there six different bits from in the narrative in chapter 24. And on the left-hand column, I want you to think, what is it that Steinbeck is kind of exploring? What's the issue? What's the idea? And this should help you form a kind of line of argument as you would in the exam. Then I've got the bit of evidence from chapter 4, so I want you to think, well, how does that show he's kind of showing this? Because again, they're too long for you to quote end to end if you were in the exam. And then what I want you to think, I want you to try and think, where else would you get evidence from the rest of the other chapters in the narrative? You can use the ones after if you want, you can use the ones before, but the best points are going to be the points that show that you have a secure knowledge of the whole text, not just bits here and there, that you are able to work together different points and create arguments that are based around trends within the narrative, not just kind of singular points within it. Okay. Now, I would expect you probably with the sheet to take at least 20 minutes, probably even up to 30, maybe even a bit longer, if you're properly choosing the evidence from across the narrative. Okay. So pause me at this point, work through the sheet, then I'll go through it and give you some kind of general points of feedback around it, okay? But as I say, this will take you a bit longer, and I want you to properly be looking over the whole of the novel, picking out those bits that you could use, because as I say, the best points, the most sophisticated points are going to be those points where everything is kind of worked together, okay? Okay, so with the first one on here, again, remember from last week or so the week before, Steinbeck kind of exploring the kind of need for people to clean themselves, for that cleanliness and kind of returning them to that sense of humanity. So Steinbeck explores the way in which people are kind of dehumanized through the kind of unhygienic conditions that they're living in, and the importance of kind of cleanliness in returning them to humanity. And again, you see here the kind of transformation idea by Seven. Dinners were over. Men had on their best clothes, freshly washed overalls, clean blue shirts. So he's returning again to that image of kind of cleansing, the clean blue shirts, the women stretched clean, their hair braided and ribboned, and the beauty that comes with it and the joy that's associated with this kind of cleanliness. And if you're making a point, you might kind of connect into potentially elsewhere, the Hooverville camps and the dirt there. You might talk about Rose's transformation in the previous chapter as part of it as well. And that is going to build you a sophisticated point where you're building together various different pieces of evidence from across the text. The next one we've got: in the tent of Ezra Huston, chairman, the central committee of 5 men went into meeting. Huston, a tall, spare man, wind-blackened with eyes like little blades, spoke to his committee, 1 man from each sanitary unit. So again, think about what Steinbeck's doing here. Well, Steinbeck is once again showing us the importance of humans working together, and that where they work together, they are empowered through it. And he's showing the importance of kind of leadership being chosen on merit, not on kind of nepotism. So the reference to kind of Ezra Huston, he's not the most attractive figure, but his eyes are like little blades. There's a kind of power given to him, and you get the reference into the kind of committees again. So again, you're looking to build this up. If you want this point about Steinbeck, what he's doing, you might connect this to the communities on the roads, how they build up each night and then take down each day. The kind of intercalary chapter where he describes this process to us. You might talk about the weed patch camp and how it's initially introduced. You might then come into this one. So you're showing, again, a good knowledge of the text, how this is something that Steinbeck is creating across the text, not just looking at one point. Then we get the next one. One of them deputies give me the lowdown. We were sitting around and he says, them goddamn government camps says, give people hot water and they're going to want hot water. Give them flush toilets and they're going to want them. Now, you could deal with this one in different ways, but the way I would approach it is, again, showing that also sort of Steinbeck suggests that the forces of law and order are actually serving as forces of repression, that they are kind of actively seeking to dehumanize the migrants. Yeah, just taking from that, trying to deny them the distaste for the government camps that's kind of showing through it. Again, think about how you could build that up with other points coming through the narrative. The police officer in the previous chapter, the shooting of the woman's hand, you could build into later on the kind of murder of Casey. The way that the police officers are often kind of shown in association with business interests. Then you've got the string bands took the real tune up and played loudly, for they were not practicing anymore. In front of their tents, the Jesus lovers sat and watched, their faces hard and contemptuous. They did not speak to one another. They watched for sin, and their faces condemned the whole proceeding. Now, remember, Steinbeck has built this dance up. The dance is one of those things that provides happiness in a very bleak world for these people. And like he's done in other chapters, he's showing how religion done in the wrong way is actually a force of division between different groups. So here you get the kind of juxtaposition of the band, of the music, and the Jesus lovers, those kind of more orthodox religious groups, sitting out and excluding themselves. And they're cut off not just from the community of the dance, Steinbeck implies. They did not speak to one another either. So they are also kind of cut off even within themselves. There's no sense of community within these groups. So again, think about where you could connect this to, how you could connect it to Casey's past and where he was preaching in the past, how you could connect it to the woman who kind of breaks Rose down in the previous chapter. These different bits of evidence that you could use to build a bigger, more sophisticated point around the way that Steinbeck is dealing with this view of religion. Then we get, I know she likes it, but it worries her too, and she's a mourning for Connie. Well, she might as well give up on him. He's probably studying to be president of the United States by now. Now, remember at various points, kind of Steinbeck has built up how the young generation, figures like Connie, have been sold this kind of easy dream that and it creates this kind of inconsistency, this false belief. And again, this has been pointed out here. He's probably studying to be president of the United States now. The kind of impossibility of doing this. This is a kind of hyperbolic image by Tom. And it shows the kind of false nature of this dream that's been sold. And again, think back to kind of earlier on in the kind of narrative where when Connie was still there, Rose showing she's got these kind of beliefs and dreams, and that Steinbeck is showing they're unrealistic. You have to work more for it. Not everybody can, do a course by mail and become the boss of a company. So various bits across like that. Okay. Then with the last one, he said bitterly, you'll do that, and I'm a 2-bit man. You'll take my job for 20 cents, and then I'll get hungry, and I'll take my job back for 15. Yeah, you go right on and do her. And again, think here how Steinbeck is showing this kind of vicious cycle in which labour costs are being driven down by supply and demand. And he's showing this as a kind of destructive process that people's desperation allows for them to be exploited. So I'll get hungry and I'll take my job back for 15. So he was getting paid more, somebody takes it for less, he gets desperate because he's got no work and it's kind of driving it down. And that level of desperation is going to kind of come into it. Again, think about where this has been built up from earlier on in the text. We've had this multiple times coming into it. The references into these handbills, how capitalism is then a system that is actively encouraging this competition in order to drive wages down, but it comes at the expense of the life and the happiness and even the sanity of these figures. And he's then kind of condemning it. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate then, summarize, you've got the continues of the kind of Marxist ideas. We've also got the kind of building up of ideas that we've had introduced already to us. And you've got to be aiming, obviously you've got to make it relevant to the question, but you've got to be thinking how you can show that you don't just know bits of the novel, that you can see trends, you can see ideas that he's developing in different ways across the novel to really be shooting for those band 6 responses. Okay, but that's it for today. Tomorrow we'll cover a bit more around chapter 25, and I'll introduce some wider reading again to kind of help go through that. Bye bye for now, people.